for joining our event here as part of the Grantham Centre and Festival of Debate. So my name is Tom Siddle. I'm a PhD student here in the Department of Economics at the University of Sheffield and a scholar at the Grantham Centre as well. So I'd like to welcome you to our event here, Our Urban Green Space is Worth It. And you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen a little schedule of our presentation. So we'll start 5 minutes just welcoming you to our event, giving you some background on the event, the speakers, and what we plan on basically hoping that you get out of the event. And then I'll pass over to my colleague, Bethany, who will give you some brief information here, and then we'll jump right into our speakers. So we have 3 speakers here today, and we'd like to thank them all for joining us for what I'm sure will be a fantastic event. So we have Vassilis joining us here. Vassilis works as an economist at the WWF, and he's finishing his PhD now at the University of Cambridge. And he'll be talking to us today about protected green space and how that interplays with urban green space, kind of framing the need for more urban green space here. We're also joined by Miriam here, who is going to take a more kind of social aspect and a health aspect. So a little bit about Miriam as well. So Miriam now works for the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. So again, we have a different perspective there, kind of like the health perspective. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Nicola Dempsey, who is going to talk to us very much about the long-term management of urban green space and a little bit more about the policy side here. Finally, you'll see here we have a note for audience questions. So please, as we do go through, submit your questions, and we'll save 20 minutes at the end. Again, if there's more questions than we anticipated, then we can flex that by 5 or 10 minutes. So please do submit your questions, and then we'll save 5 minutes for concluding remarks. So with that being said, let me pass on to my co-chair, Bethany, who will give you a little bit more information about the kind of talk itself. And yeah, enjoy the event, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's brilliant. So yes, we really hope that you'll get a lot out of this event and hopefully learn a bit more about the benefits of urban green spaces and potentially some of the issues or conflicts in kind of urban land use and how we can use our green spaces to the best of their abilities. We're hoping that we'll have a really interesting debate with our multidisciplinary panel who are coming at this kind of topic from a very different perspectives and also kind of very different backgrounds. So we have obviously academics, but also people working for NGOs and in healthcare as well. So we have quite a quite a broad perspective from this topic, which is really, really brilliant. So just a few housekeeping rules before we start. So all of the audience, your microphones and cameras will be muted throughout the whole of the debate, but if you have any questions or issues, feel free to drop questions in the chat about if you have any tech issues or whatever's going on. For specific questions for the speakers, there's a specific function. If you go down to the bottom of your screen on the right hand side, there's a little triangle and square and circle. If you click on that, there should be a Q&A function which you can use to submit specific questions, which we'll use later in our Q&A. So ideally, if you can use that function for questions for our speakers, but if you can't find that or are having any issues, you can drop them in the chat as well. So I think that's everything from us. So we'll hand over to our first speaker.
Thank you. Sharing my screen now. Do you see this in full screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, Tom and Beth, and for organizing this event. It's great to be here. And I'm really looking forward to learning both from what Nicola and Miriam have to say. I admit urban green spaces are not my specialization. My research has been focusing on national parks and protected areas. And there's 2 things I've learned from my research. The first one is, being an economist, I had to learn quite quickly that in spite of there being a lot of quantitative methods for being able to evaluate the impacts that protected areas have on people and how we rely on them and how they support our economy, one of the key aspects I learned is that the interaction between humans and nature is very, very important. And it has been essentially, that's what determines in very large extent whether us protectors are successful or not at conserving nature. And the second thing I've learned is that there's simply not enough nature out there for all of us to be able to enjoy the benefits that nature has to provide. So if we agree, for instance, that nature gives us a lot of happiness, space for recreation, health, well-being, and that if we agree that we need to access, there's simply not enough national parks, protected areas, or open space for us to enjoy it, and we need something closer to us in an urban environment. So this is sort of the angle I'll take in this presentation, and I hope to be able to convince you on this. So my background is I grew up in Athens. So Athens is a very, very densely populated city. There's not a lot of nature within the city. But what's interesting about it is that it's literally surrounded by mountains, which you can sort of see in this photo in the background. You can see the mountains region, and then on the south side you have the sea. So it's like enclosed within nature, but there's very little nature inside it, which is very interesting because growing up in such an environment, I sort of realized that it was embedded in my mind that, you know, nature is something beyond the city, something that you have to cross the mountains to get, you have to go into the sea to reach. And that's why I think while there wasn't a lot of nature in my life growing up, when I was like living within the city, maybe some on holidays. And I think this is a paradigm that should be challenged and should change. And I think in this country, people, meaning the UK, people are quite better. I think that you're closer to nature. If it's the Duke of Edinburgh, if it's the fact that London is one of the greenest cities out there. But I think this connection to nature is quite stronger. And this has featured in my research as well when we explore the impacts in different protected areas across different countries. And specifically, what I aim to cover here is that there is 3 overall problems that we currently have with access to nature in the UK. I should say that my research has focused mostly in Europe. So I'm part of a research team where we collect data from approximately 12 countries on the protected areas. So what we try to estimate is what are the social impacts that protected areas have on local communities and people, and what are the benefits they provide us. So that's what we're trying to assess. So if I've spent a lot of time in national parks, and as I mentioned earlier, I've seen firsthand that we need more nature whenever we can get it, and I think urban green space are a great place to complement this. But there will be 3 axes where I'll be sort of trying to demonstrate this. The first one is on equity, and this the 25-year environment plan that the UK government published 5 years ago explains very clearly that there is a lack of access to protected areas, especially with children, especially with disadvantaged areas. So even though, for instance, we have many national parks in the UK, and some of them are beautiful, you can go and explore them, they're free to go to, there's not many people who have been visiting them. In fact, 12% of children do not visit the natural environment each year. And this is even more impressive if we start to consider what is nature for us. Like, so if you're in your everyday life, what is your access to nature? For instance, I spend most of my time between my house and my office. I don't have a garden where I live, therefore I don't spend too much time in nature. So only these excursions into a protected area is what will offer me this escape into nature. And this is even more so true for many people living in cities. So this is one problem where currently protected areas do not meet this need. Like, the access to them is restricted to few people who have the ability to visit protected areas whenever they can. So access to nature there, not as good. And another thing that is established in the 25-year environment plan is that the government has committed to improve access to urban green space, and they have found that and a study that I'm referencing here has found that access to urban green spaces is dependent on income, age, education, and children in households. So there are issues with who is able to access nature right now. And this is the government's commitment on greening out towns and creating more of these urban spaces. The second one is more on access, right? So regardless, let's take the justice and who can access protected areas out of it in terms of economic background. But if we focus just on pure access, as you can see, this is an article that came out last week because MPs this week are debating on the right to roam, and there's a massive campaign to try and improve right to roam in nature. Sort of, this means being able to explore nature wherever you can without being stopped, so as to have this freedom of enjoying nature without any restrictions or fences preventing you from doing so. And 92 constituencies in England allow no right to roam, as that shows. And if you look at this map, it's really sad. It's, as it stands, only 8% of the English countryside is open for people to freely roam across. and most of it is in Scotland. So even if you had the money, even if you wanted and had the willingness to visit nature, you have to travel pretty far to be able to access protected areas. So we have so far equity preventing us from doing so, access, and the third axis, which I'll discuss now, is the overcrowding bit. And this is where I've seen, this is a bit that has come out of my own research. But before this, I would like to provide some context on what a protected area is, because personally, before I start, as I said, my background is in economics. I used to work in oil shipping and development, so I didn't know much about protected areas. In my mind, they look pretty much like a zoo, which you either pay a ticket or you enter, and then you enjoy nature, and then you leave at the end of the day. But reality is, especially in Europe, we have our protected areas are very, very different, and there's no one that's the same as the other. But essentially, imagine having this system. We call them socio-ecological system, because as you can see, we have some social components in there. We have, for instance, manufacturing, agriculture, cities, villages, houses, and the natural environment, and all these coexist. And what protected areas look like, we then decide which of these assets in this system we have are more worth protecting, right? So we select, for instance, some of them will be part of Zone A, where very limited activity will be allowed. We won't allow the destruction of nature. But then you have Zone B, for instance, where people and nature coexist on a daily basis. And we cannot just tell these people who've lived there for many years and their families have created livelihoods in them, we cannot just tell them they need to stop doing that, just so we can protect nature globally, and also just so we can go and enjoy nature whenever we want to visit, right? So we have to acknowledge that local people have rights, and local people have also needs that they drive out of nature, and our laws cannot prevent them from doing so. And all of this, so all of this I present here, this would be a protected area, right? So all of these things, so there are people living inside protected areas. There's, for instance, manufacturing would be in there. In some countries, they allow mining, extraction, right? So this, we can debate, for instance, what activity should be allowed, but we should acknowledge that all of this coexists, and that's what we call protected areas. So when you hear national parks, all of these things would be part of national parks in many cases. And based on a study that a professor at Cambridge has done, is that they found that this is forecasting on life, so the number could not be very accurate, but you can get the size of it, that large protected areas receive roughly 8 billion visits per year, and most of which more than 80% are in Europe and North America. So in our case, because a lot of us live in cities, because we're more affluent, for instance, than people in the global south, we see protected areas as a tourism destination, or somewhere that we go to explore for the day or for the weekend or for the week. And this is mostly what protected areas are to us. And they're very popular, as you can see. And this creates problems. And for us, apart from the study I'm referencing here, we saw it, we got a huge demand from our research group to come and do these assessments. We do these social impact assessments in protected areas with our research team, especially during the COVID period, because there were many protected areas that were struggling with the sudden overcrowding. And these came, for instance, from protected areas here in the UK, such as the Peak District of Snowdonia, or from some in Sweden, such as Kullaberg, where suddenly people weren't able to travel abroad. So the only destination they had to be able to go and enjoy nature, or to travel overall, were national parks. And this created a lot of conflicts with people, a lot of overcrowding. And this is problematic for two reasons. The first one is that the natural environment in this area could be degraded, because then you have many people accessing it, many people not complying with rules. It's much harder to control such groups of people. But the second big problem is it creates conflicts with locals. And I'll show this. We have first data showing this in our research, where if you have a protected area and suddenly all the car parks are busy, or all the walks are busy, or people who are not involved, local communities who are not involved in tourism in this area, suddenly feel they're sort of pushed out of this area, and all this identity of the area that they live in is changing. And I know this may sound a bit abstract, but it creates real problems in how effectively we can run protected areas, this overcrowding. That's why urban green spaces can help relieve this by creating an outlet for people to enjoy nature without necessarily overcrowding. But I'll get to this, because I accept that this relation between visiting national park as opposed to going to your local park is not a linear one, and obviously we prefer national parks to park, but there is some burden they can relieve, and I'll explain that in a minute. And this also is true for marine protected areas, right? So we observe overcrowding there. We have a lot of conflicts between communities. This is a study that I referenced where this has happened, and this has happened in some of the cases and parks we have visited. So this is a research project. This is what we do. It's called Fidelia. And we have visited over 20 national parks in 12 countries, and done these assessments. And the impacts you perceive vary significantly. So it could be, for instance, some positive ones, we suddenly have higher agricultural productivity because of the environmental benefits. It could be increased income from tourism. It could be, people being happier, but you have many negative ones where suddenly there's conflicts between locals and tourists. There is lower economic growth because some activities are no longer permissible within the park. And this leads to what I was explaining before, to alienation of locals from the governance of the national park. And this creates significant problems with running them. And this is what national parks look like, right? So this is one of the parks I visited where you see there's fishermen, there is agricultural production, and there's locals who've been living there for ages. And this is what they call home. And this is a very stark example of what I was trying to explain before, of sort of the impacts, the negative impacts that overcrowding of national parks has. This is two examples from Snowdonia National Park and the Gkoumas National Park in France. But as you can see, the red dots represent people who feel the benefit from, who perceive positive impacts from national park. This one is on recreation in Snowdonia and on quality of life in the Gkoumas. And you can see that the blue dots are inside the national park in the case of Snowdonia, because people inside, they feel that their ability to enjoy the park has been compromised because of the sudden overcrowding. This data was taken during COVID. Whereas people on the periphery of the park felt more positively, so they felt they could benefit easier from the park for its recreation because they didn't live there. And in the Gkoumas is near Marseille. And as you can see, there's a very big positive cluster within Marseille, where people, yeah, of course, we love it. It has a great impact on our quality of life, but we see no such impacts within the national park, which is right here. So we can see this, and this is true across many parks that we've worked with, including Greece, the UK, and France. And just to come to this conclusion, to explain to you why this is important, why we need urban green spaces, because there are studies out there that show that lack of engagement with locals is preventing the expansion of national parks. We need to create new national parks, but we're not able to because locals are not supportive of this because of all these conflicts. Secondly, when we try to conserve forests, we find local standards are opposed to it because of the overcrowding of tourists that national parks result with. And if we accept that we need this access to nature, and currently only national parks are provided, then it only makes sense that more urban green spaces are necessary to provide this relief. And personally, I think I've been enjoying many nice days in big parks in London, such as Regent's Park or Hyde Park. And I can see the very clear benefit of how they can help us improve access to nature, so we address all these equity and justice issues, but at the same time, they help us relieve all the pressures from protected areas. And I don't think they will replace urban green space will replace national parks, but at the very least, I think they can complement this to help us address some of the issues. So with this, I'll finish. Thank you very much again for listening, and I'll pass on to you, Thomas.
So thank you again, Vassilis. Thank you for a very interesting talk. So while our next speaker loads up, while Miriam loads the slides, I'd like to reflect on that. I think there's some very interesting things in there. So overcrowding is interesting because if you have more people moving into a certain area, then you're moving other people away from that area through kind of this overcrowding. And you're essentially changing the composition of people who have access. So that's something that we maybe speak on later on. But for now, Miriam, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Great, thank you, Thomas. So hi everyone. Thanks to the Festival of Debate for inviting me along tonight. My name's Miriam Dobson, and I lead on trees and woodlands at the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, which runs the NHS Forest Project. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the sorts of things that we do and some illustrative examples of the use of green space by the NHS and further afield in healthcare. So the NHS Forest is a good practice network of around 350 healthcare sites across the UK who are championing the use of their estates to benefit the health and well-being of staff, patients and the wider community. And our sites range from GP practices through to ambulance stations, urban general hospitals and rural mental health institutions with large grounds. So the variety of green space activities that's undertaken by the NHS is really extensive. And I'm going to give a few examples of these shortly. So here at the NHS Forest and the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, we support NHS sites in an advisory and in a practical capacity. So we help hospitals develop plans for the improvement of their green estates. We champion the role that the NHS green estate can play in supporting the health of the general population, not just people inside the hospital grounds. And we train NHS staff in best practice in different forms of green space management. The NHS Forest began life in 2009 as a tree planting programme that was used as an engagement activity to start talking to the NHS about its carbon footprint and the impact of climate change on health. And trees now remain a primary focus of our work, and that's kind of especially true at the moment. And the majority of our work now is funded under the Trees Call to Action grant. But our tree planting activities have developed, and so we're now focused on improving tree canopy cover across the NHS estate for its own sake, rather than simply as an engagement tool, and communicating the multitude of benefits that trees have the potential to provide. And alongside this, we continue to donate trees to the NHS, and we do the associated advisory work to help sites with their species selection, planting programme design and care for their trees. We also work in assisting the NHS with woodland management and even woodland creation, where some sites own larger areas of land. And we've been using a GIS-based approach to prioritise sites across the country where the potential contribution of tree planting to environmental or public health is greatest. But back to green space more generally. We'll just give a brief overview of some of the projects that NHS forest sites are involved in to get a flavour of the types of green space use that healthcare sites undertake. So firstly, on the clinical side of things, outdoor spaces in healthcare centres can be used for physiotherapy, so you can bring treatment outside using kind of steps, ramps, uneven ground for walking on. Green walking, which is kind of walking in green spaces, whether that's on a healthcare site or outside a healthcare site, apologies, is a key issue that we advocate for in mental health settings. So we've got a network of occupational therapists who use green walking in their practice, and a guide that we produce, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. And the top left picture here is a piece of work that we did at Mount Vernon Cancer Centre in Hertfordshire, where an outdoor chemotherapy shelter was developed to give patients the option to take their chemotherapy treatment into an outdoor setting. So many of our sites have a focus on green space development for staff wellbeing. As sure everyone's aware, staff wellbeing is a key issue for the NHS. Our report in 2020 called Space to Breathe investigated barriers that NHS staff face to accessing nature whilst at work. And basically there's loads of barriers that are really specific to that clinical context that mean that staff really struggle to get outside during the working day, and as a result don't experience the benefits of being outside, being in nature and green space that they could be accessing on site. So for the past few years, we've employed a number of nature recovery ranges. That's on a site-based level. And one of them is in the bottom right-hand corner here. And part of their remit has been on running nature engagement activities with staff at their sites in order to encourage greater and better use of the outdoor spaces at the hospital. And of course, some of our sites are better set up for this than others. So the top right picture here is the grounds of the GP surgery in Grantown-on-Spey, which benefits from its location in the Gkoumas National Park. And you can see their woodland location there, which makes accessing green space at work quite easy. But in urban sites as well, we've seen some kind of small pockets of increased green space engagement by staff have a really big impact. So the top left set picture on this slide is from a site that ran a competition where each ward was challenged to improve whatever outdoor space they had. So that led to the development of some really nice gardens and some more engagement by staff with nature and spending time outdoors. And so finally, as this quick run through some examples, food growing is a particular focus for many of our sites, and that's for the benefits it can provide to patients and to staff. So food growing can be utilised in a therapeutic way. So it's really popular at mental health institutions where gardening can form part of service users' therapy and treatment. And a number of these sites use the produce grown in the hospital kitchens as well, or in cookery classes for service users. The top left picture here, just going abroad for a second, is at Boston Medical Center in Massachusetts, where they have a huge rooftop gardening project, and that feeds the hospital catering service, but it also feeds local community members in a needs-based way. So it creates opportunities for people to access healthy and nutritious food where they might not otherwise be able to access that in their kind of local environment or from shops, or because it's too expensive, or they live in food deserts. But it also provides a place for people to connect with others and develop personal relationships through the shared activity of gardening. And the bottom left photo here, what you can see is actually a staff allotment at Southmead Hospital in Bristol. And so that's been used by staff to foster sort of wellbeing and social opportunities at work. And Southmead also have a rooftop herb garden, which has picnic benches and adjoins the staff canteen. So people can sit outside in their lunch breaks, but also learn about and harvest herbs to take home. And all the herbs grown have signs on them about their medicinal uses. So sort of an educational opportunity in bringing different forms of healthcare together, but within a hospital setting. So yeah, like that's kind of a really brief run through of a lot of really great projects that we work with, and there's loads more that I could talk about, including kind of more environmental focused projects such as woodland creation and restoration, or SUD systems at hospitals and their impact on biodiversity. But yeah, not short on time, so not quite time to cover everything today, but we've got quite a lot of case studies on the NHS Forest website if anyone's interested in kind of delving further into those different uses of green space in a therapeutic or a clinical setting. So at the NHS Forest, our emphasis is really on moving green space up the NHS agenda. So it isn't just seen as something that's nice to have, but it's seen as an essential component of public health, as well as contributing to ways in which the NHS state can support biodiversity in the wider environment through the ways in which it uses its land. As I'm sure many people are aware, there's a growing body of academic evidence to support this, as well as a renewed interest in the links between green space and health in the past few years, particularly following a lot of people's personal journey of realising how important green space was for their own well-being during the COVID lockdowns. So there's a few examples on this slide, and there's a screenshot of the evidence database that we maintain on the NHS Forest website. So we collate relevant policy and academic reports on the links between green space and health. And whilst there's now a huge amount of evidence kind of in general for the links between natural environments and health, for example, seen in the Natural England report that I've put a screenshot on in the bottom left there, and they've got a report on environment and physical health and a report on environment and mental health, which are really good literature reviews for anyone kind of investigating this topic. We've also got a specific body of evidence related to clinical and healthcare settings. And this was really kicked off in 1984, and there was a publication of a seminal paper by Ulrich, which demonstrated that patients who had a view of green spaces from their hospital bed out of a window recovered faster and recovered with less need for painkillers than those who did not. So green space really feeds in not just for kind of its own benefit and for well-being benefits, but it's all linked with down the chain with the NHS reducing its carbon footprint. If people have better access to green space, resulting in better health at the outset, or better health outcomes and less need for prescription drugs, then you have less need to produce drugs, and then the carbon footprint of that pharmaceutical industry goes down as a result as well. So it's all linked in. And so to conclude, I just leave you with a few pictures, which are a few examples of biophilic design in hospitals, so real integration of green space into a healthcare setting. These are mostly examples from Southeast Asia, who have a few projects that are probably a few decades ahead of us when it comes to this sort of thing. But we're really encouraged to see more inclusion of green space in some of the designs for hospitals that are going to be built under the New Hospitals programme. And yeah, just continuing to really see what's possible when you put nature at the heart of healthcare. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Miriam. Again, another fantastic talk. As soon as you said GIS, I was hooked. I really like it. And again, this is really great. I mean, this talks a lot about the well-known issue of obviously giving green space access to patients, but the under talks about issue of providing green space to workers. Again, I think that's really fantastic. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. So we'll now pass on to Nicola in the interest of time. And again, I can see some fantastic questions coming through. So we'll address those at the end. So Nicola, the floor or the computer is yours.
Thank you very much. Hope that you can hear me and that you can see my slides at full range. Is that, if I can't hear you, I'm presuming all is good. Okay. So yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and the Festival of Debate. I'm Nicola. I work in the Department of Landscape Architecture here in the University of Sheffield. I'm beaming from the Arts Tower at the moment. I teach and do research into urban landscape planning and management. So this means I take a lot of time thinking about the overriding question that we're posing in this debate about our urban green spaces, worth it? And I tried to take a long-term view to this, which is what this idea of placekeeping is all about, which is that little flowery icon in the middle. Through my research, I continue to find that the answer to this is an overwhelming yes, it is. Green spaces are definitely worth it in our urban areas. And it's been a yes for an awful long time. As long as there have been humans, there have been green spaces. If we take a local example, this is Loxley and Wadsley Common here in Sheffield. Commons being places where for centuries people have been able to graze their animals, or pollard, cut back young trees if they need the wood, or take fallen branches for fires, firewood. Not all urban green space was publicly available like this, and we do have to think about private spaces. We can think about gardens, which hark back millennia, as places for food growing and recreation, but ideas that sort of underpin some of those designs, some of those plans, spilled out into the private domain and into the public realm that we see today. So it may be hunting grounds, as once were, the hunting grounds of our kings and queens, that become one of London's largest and most famous parks here. Or we can go back slightly slightly more recently to the Victorian era, where we have examples of historic parks in our towns and cities. This is Weston Park, right next door to where I am now. So what I'm trying to say here is that the value of green space is not a new idea. And as we've already been hearing, in fact, we know an awful lot about why urban green spaces are so worth it and they're so good for us. There is masses of research, more than ever, I think, which demonstrate the benefits of having urban green space near you and using them in some way, if it's looking out onto them or getting into them and making more active use. And they can increase the value of your house, help your mental well-being and physical health. They can help alleviate flooding when we have heavy rain, provide cool areas in the city as temperatures rise with the changing climate. And by providing habitats for birds, other animals, butterflies and insects, they not only have a benefit for biodiversity, but when we notice this nature in urban areas, this can bring us extra health and well-being benefits, which builds on some research that we've done in the department over the last few years. We feel better when we notice nature, even if the habitats are not particularly appropriate for the birds we might see here. But all towns and cities have got green space that they're dependent on, but it's the nature of that dependence which has changed over time. We may no longer need to go into the forest for our firewood, but I believe that we do fundamentally need to provide urban green space if we're going to provide housing for our citizens. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with our starting point. We've moved away from an understanding of how important green space is in our cities. Housing should be much more than this. It should be much more than this, but I have to say in my research, this is increasingly the norm. So when we talk about housing, we do have to stop thinking about it as just the dwelling, as just the bricks and mortar. A colleague of ours, John Miller, who's based in the School of English, he talks about this when he considers how the street trees outside his house, which are not part of the dwelling and not part of his private space, he talks about them and being part of his and his family's home. And you can see, just generally the proximity that we have to this nature, why that's the case. To really create housing that people want to live in, we have to stop thinking about it as housing, as bricks and mortar, as a physical space that stops at the front door. We should be using other terms like homes, neighbourhoods and communities, but with a full understanding of what that means. As soon as you make that switch, housing by definition must include urban green space. Otherwise, it's just not a place that people will want to live in. But for me, urban green spaces are always going to lose out in a debate if we pitch them against housing. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of political debates go. We can't necessarily put money into urban green spaces because we need to put money into the healthcare system, social care, police, education. All of these are statutory services, the ones that our governments must legally provide. And they're always going to win out if they're pitched against urban green spaces. But I think that it's a long used and an outdated and quite tired argument, I think. And it's time that our politicians and other decision makers stop using it. It's not about urban green space versus the housing developer or urban green spaces versus other services. This mindset has got to change, because it's not like we didn't do it in the past. It's not like we haven't got precedents. And it's not like we don't see it when we go elsewhere and we go overseas. This is an example from the Netherlands. And we are doing it, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this isn't happening anywhere. This is an example from Black Horse in London. And then if you go closer to home, if you are in Sheffield, and if you've not been up to the Manor Estate, I would definitely recommend a visit, because that is a place, that's a neighbourhood where the urban green spaces are an integral part of this idea of home. But as I say, unfortunately, it's not the norm. And this is because I believe there has been a loss of sight of the value that urban green space can have in the pursuit of profit. I think Kelham Island, for those of you who know Sheffield, is an example where there's been little joined up thinking about where green space fits into this neighbourhood, because individual housing developers have not been held accountable to do better. And that's the part that our policymakers can play in all of this. So obviously I am in favour of urban green spaces, but I'm not naive. There are obviously caveats and things that we need to bear in mind. They can't just exist for the sake of it. They have to function. There has to be, ideally multiple functions for why an urban green space exists. And as I say, we have lots of historical examples of that, and where functions are changing over time. So here are just a few examples of a few random ones, and me trying to shoehorn photos of friends and family wherever possible. But sometimes the functions are not necessarily the ones that the designer intends. Here's a swing that is also, it's multifunctional, but it's also used to train fighting dogs, which is why there are some holes in the rubber there. Not necessarily what the designer would have wanted. And while we cannot necessarily tell or predict how people are going to use urban green spaces, we've long known that spaces can't look after themselves. Those tyres, for example, are not going to move themselves. Urban green spaces have to be managed. These are some of our students getting out and doing a bit of this on the ground maintenance in a space nearby in the Ponderosa. And this is why urban green spaces need to be managed, because when they're not, they can be perceived to be a liability. And if you don't think about that management and long-term maintenance of these spaces, then that's a kind of almost an inevitable downward spiral, and they can be considered a liability. And I think, for me anyway, that's why we're sort of talking about this question today about, are urban green spaces worth it? It's not just because, for me, I think that we're asking this question because green spaces don't have the political support that they really need. There's rhetoric, there's lots of talk about how much politicians, understand the importance of our urban green spaces. It's, you'll never hear a politician say they don't like parks or trees, but the political support is meaningless if there isn't sustained funding to go with it to support that ongoing management and maintenance. Green spaces really are worth it, but they do need to be designed and planned properly. They can be functional and beautiful, as landscape architect Brenda Colvin said in the past, and there has to be a thinking about that management. So we can look at a whole range of urban green spaces. Some are very small. Here is a particularly unsuccessful example. This was once a green wall, and it might have been an eye-catching feature when it was first created and designed, but it was probably always doomed to fail. As we can see, without water, without maintenance, it just died. Similarly, here we can see what happens when maintenance isn't carried out. This just becomes unusable, and then perhaps becomes abandoned, feels abandoned, and then people aren't going to spend time there. And the research I do outlines how precarious urban green spaces can seem. They're robust in terms of the vegetation that will grow, but if they're not cared for, people will avoid them and can, like here, start to abuse them. So without political action, not just the rhetoric, not just the words, but without that political action to help create and manage our urban green spaces for the long term, which are really and easily accessible for citizens, they're never going to be considered as valuable as some of the other functions in our urban landscapes. And it's interesting to see what constitutes urban green spaces. Lots of little tiny urban green spaces popping up, being created, little micro pockets perhaps that are relaxing for us, but for biodiversity, they're making things very difficult in terms of sort of the little critters trying to fly between these little islands. And also urban green spaces that have to be permanent. They can't just be an installation for a few months like this was. The Mound in London, described as one of the most disastrous and very expensive failures for a long time. Open for 6 months, cost over £6 million. That money is equivalent to almost 2 annual budgets that Sheffield City Council has to look after all their parks and green spaces in the entire city. So clearly there is money for urban green spaces if there is political support. So to conclude, as I pointed out, to truly capture that value of urban green space with all those benefits and those range of functions, we do need to take management and maintenance of urban green space more seriously. It's not just a nice thing to have. We can't just expect it to happen once the designers finish and we've left the park with all our litter behind. It needs to be designed, planned and managed for the long term. And so in my opinion, you just can't have housing without urban green spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Nicola. Another great talk, really good. Instantly my brain was moving when you started talking about planning and long-term management. Instantly my brain thought, oh, garden towns. Or maybe that's something we pick up later, because we have some really great questions, so I want to give time to go over them. So Beth, if we can jump into the questions, I'm sure you've got a great one from the audience.
Yeah, so we've had some sent in beforehand as well. So to kind of start, obviously, Nicola's just mentioned housing is a big issue, and there are obviously issues with other urban land uses. Like, how do we balance some of the kind of conflicts or maybe mitigate them once they exist? Is this kind of mainly a political issue, or are there kind of social solutions as well?
I can have a go at starting with that. I think it's a mixture of both. I think that, yeah, as I've mentioned, that political support will make things happen. But again, that's got to have some of that funding behind it that's meaningful. There are examples of more sort of bottom-up and socially driven approaches to looking at those conflicts. And again, it's about, I think, getting the right people around the table. A lot of it might not necessarily about the places we're talking about, but more how those decisions are made. So if those right people are there at the table, then I think that that's a really good starting point.
Yep, and this kind of ties in with a question as well for Vassilis. So how do you feel like people, so people might be moved out of areas, right? So areas become overcrowded, demand increases for properties, and you move people out of areas. Do you see that in your research, and what kind of effects do you think that has on the urban environment?
Yeah, so our survey has picked up on this. I don't know to what extent this applies also to urban green spaces. I imagine it would. I think, as someone mentioned, the Q&A with gentrification and the improvement on some urban areas. But in protected areas, for instance, in the north of England, in the Gkoumas, where we've done some research, there is a lot of disappointment from local people who've lived there for very long. And now, they see that their children don't have any interest in staying because there's not many opportunities for them to stay in the area. But at the same time, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to afford a second to buy a home for themselves, because many people would have second houses inside the national park, bringing up the prices. So it is something we've come up with. In terms of addressing it, so there was a question on how to address it. I think in protected areas, what you need is a managing authority that really takes in the views and perspectives of locals, because then it's very likely that they'll develop a way for protecting local citizens from it. And this happens with other things, like, for instance, in a lot of marine protected areas, we have fishermen, fishers. Sorry, there will be protectionist policies in place protecting the local fishers to make sure that their interests are protected, even though the area is also conserved. So you have such policies in place. I'm sure they can make something similar for housing. But yeah, in terms of urban green space, I would imagine that would be similar, but I'm not as familiar with what policies can be used to address this in this area.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then we've got a question from Yarden, specifically for Miriam, about whether you find that staff have different needs of green spaces compared to the general population, and then whether or not you work with landscape architectures in designing kind of the aspects of these spaces as well.
Yeah, so it's really varied. I think what I would say is that obviously NHS staff are kind of normal people, and they have like the same sort of need for time outside and connection with nature, and like they experience the same health benefits that anyone else would from that. But the specific issues surrounding kind of some of the barriers that we found with staff accessing nature at work in the NHS was that need for privacy. And so at work, obviously you have staff and patients, which you wouldn't necessarily have in, you know, a normal kind of office environment where everyone's staff. And so a lot of the responses we had when we did our Space to Breathe report was that people would like to go and access green space and like to go and sit and chat and like have lunch outside, but they can't go and sit and chat with their colleagues if that space is also accessible to the general public because of patient confidentiality. And the same with things like taking therapy sessions outside or taking meetings with patients outside, where the ideal situation to have kind of like certain meetings with patients or to give people certain pieces of news might be to be in a natural environment or to be walking, but you can't do that unless you have a privacy. So that's a specific issue, I guess, for the NHS. In terms of working with landscape architects, yeah, it's a really case-by-case basis. Obviously, with those larger projects or new build hospitals, then landscape architects are involved. But most hospitals and most healthcare settings, if they're setting up kind of a bit of horticultural therapy or a courtyard garden or something like that, the benefit, what we work with them on we work with the NHS completely for free, and so that's why we've been able to do quite a lot of our projects that we have done and quite a lot of the advisory work we've done, because NHS budgets are really tight and they won't necessarily always be able to bring somebody in. What quite a few of our sites have managed to access is kind of using local community groups or hospital supported networks or even just local Facebook groups. And what they found is that professionals will actually often be quite receptive to doing pro bono work for the NHS, just because it's the NHS and we all rely on it. So kind of pointing people to places where they might be able to get free advice has been really important.
Yeah, that's really comprehensive, Miriam. We've had a really good question from the audience as well that I think applies to kind of all of our speakers here, actually. So the question is, has landscape design become an afterthought in regional city planning? So is the idea of throwing houses up maybe, or throwing green space up, has that become like secondary? Has the design become secondary to that? Feel free to take the floor, anybody. Interesting question.
I'm happy to go. I imagine you would know more about this, Nicola. But from my perspective, I've been trying to analyze this with the biodiversity net gain policy that the UK government has introduced, where for every new development, you have 10%, 110% of nature replaced. So whatever was destroyed for this development, you have to be replaced plus 10%. And it's interesting to see, like, even though we have like an environment improvement plan that's nationwide and it says these are our targets, and this is good, that's what you need, because you need all these arguments we discussed today, they need to coexist. And then this policy comes out and it considers only like a specific biodiversity metric. So as long as you replace 1 for 1 from an ecological perspective, which we could still argue whether this is accurate or not, but it's only replaces this 1 for 1. And the considerations of the things we just discussed are not in it. So I don't think, for instance, access to nature or green spaces is something that's considered. So, you know, if new developments going forward, which is like you think low-hanging fruit, because now we know better, so we could design better neighborhoods going in the future, but this is not something that's considered. So I think that's disappointing. So even though I think there is a plan, a nationwide plan, even though there are some specific policies that aim to address specific issues, I think there's not enough interaction between them to ensure that the optimal outcome is provided. But I bet, Nicola, you would have more to say.
No, just to say, I totally agree. The biodiversity net gain idea could have, I think on paper, sounded like it was going to be a really good start to try and get that, bringing together housing and landscape design, planning and management together. But yeah, it's incredibly disappointing. I think beforehand we had landscape designers who will be coming in at the very end, you know, of the process of planning and designing housing developments. And I think even with this new push towards the biodiversity net gain, what we don't know is how it's going to be managed. So I completely agree. Some of the metrics just seem to be completely at odds with some of the things that we're grappling with in terms of climate change, in terms of, you know, making real effective change. And one of the sticking points is that you can, you know, a developer could build without improving any biodiversity on their site. That could be going somewhere else. So you know, and that doesn't necessarily need to be within walking distance of, say, those people who are going to be buying those new houses. So yeah, I think as it develops, it will be very interesting to see how it works out, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of critics.
Yeah, of course, some very interesting topics here. And again, I'll bring it back. Garden Village, that's what I instantly think of. The planning, the forward planning, the design. Again, some really interesting concepts. I do have one more question quickly, actually. And this might be more directed at Miriam and Nicola, and then we'll wrap up the section and on some concluding remarks. So Nicola, you talked about green spaces being used for cooling down cities. So this idea about urban heat islands. Do you think expanding the number of green spaces is the answer, or do you think expanding what we already have is the answer? I'd be interested to if you have any thoughts.
So I would say historically, you can see there's across cities, it's not always equal access to green space. So I would say I'm not sure that they're two different kind of options there. I think, you know, more and more of the urban green spaces would be what we'd be looking for wherever possible. And I think if we're talking about access, then trying to get people on an equal footing. I saw a question in there which was around sort of gentrification, and where you might have some areas that are benefiting more from you know, greenery. Historically, we've had that for a long time. If you think about where some of the Victorian parks are, they're not always located in the areas of greatest need. They tended to be in the areas where the air was good and you could go and feel healthier, not necessarily in the more industrial areas. So I'm thinking that yes, it is about more. And somebody's just put in as a comment there, yeah, corridors, thinking about how those are connectors. And yeah, getting from different spaces across the city. I'm not sure the tiny little scraps of spaces like the ones I showed are the answer. So in that respect, maybe not the more in number, but yeah, certainly increasing the area and tree canopy coverage as well, for sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to take the opportunity to flag a project that I'm involved in, working in partnership with the Woodland Trust and an organisation called American Forests, which is going to be launched at the end of the year. And it's bringing what's called a tree equity score to the UK. So essentially, this is an online mapping tool where you can look at a neighbourhood level of the relationship between tree canopy cover and various different measures of equity and deprivation. And each neighbourhood, so we're looking at lower super output areas, which is kind of a postcode area, really. They're going to be given a score based on the tree equity that currently exists, and then a target score based on what we would consider to be the target level of tree canopy cover for that area based on the amount of available planting space. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that, because I think that's going to be really interesting and hopefully really direct tree planting and increase the equity of tree canopy cover in urban areas as time goes on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And that kind of feeds into the question we just had, which is talking about how can we create green spaces in poorer areas such as the northeast of Sheffield rather than just the southwest, which I think we've covered a little bit. But if anyone wants to quickly jump in on that.
I could just briefly say, I think coverage of green space in Sheffield is actually good across the city, but what's not so good is the quality of those spaces. So I think that it's not just enough to provide that green space that's there. It's about what's going on in them, how safe people feel in them, you know, who's using them, and, you know, who feels that they can use them. So I think, yeah, while it may feel that there's more going on in the southwest, for sure, and certainly things like, you know, a woodland that's in the northeast will not be anywhere near as well visited, even though the bluebells look stunning at the moment, as a woodland in the southwest. They are there, but there's definitely more work to do to improve that access, for sure.
That's great. Thank you so much, particularly to our speakers. That's been a really, really brilliant session. I hope that everyone's, yeah, had a lot of things to think about. It's been, yeah, really, really insightful. It's been great to hear about your work. And yes, so thank you also to our group, so to Raoul and to Tom, to Hanyu, to Miles, for putting it all together. It's been really, really brilliant, and particularly a big thank you to Yana and Deborah. This is the last of our series of festival debates at the Grantham Centre, and they've been really helpful in helping us all to kind of pull them all together. It's been really, really brilliant. So a huge thank you, a shout out to them for kind of, yeah, assisting us along the way. It's been really, really brilliant. We really hope that the audience has kind of, yeah, had a brilliant time today. We have a holding slide, possibly if Tom can put it up, with contact details from our speakers. So if you had any questions that we didn't have time to kind of answer, or you go away today and think about any more that you might want to send over, they're happy for you to contact them and ask any questions that you might have. Yeah, so that's really brilliant. Yeah, so kind of as a really brief sum up, we've kind of heard about the overcrowding of rural green space from Vassilis, which has been really interesting to kind of think about the importance of investing in urban green spaces, and the benefits of urban green spaces to public health, and the kind of ways that green space is being used in healthcare currently, which is brilliant. And then we've obviously heard also kind of from the planning perspective in terms of housing and kind of the conflict there between what we're doing with our urban areas and kind of how we can integrate green space into our urban areas. So it's been really, really brilliant, the session. I'm not sure whether Tom can get that side up, but I think we'll be able to send that information over after the fact.
Yes, sorry for speakers, if you do have your contact information at hand, please do put it in the Q&A, in the chat box. Apologies, we don't have that to hand. But yeah, please do, like I say, make use of our speakers. They're really knowledgeable. So any questions you have, please direct them their way. And thank you again for coming. Really great session. Thank you again to our speakers as well. Really appreciate that. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Have a well-earned rest.
Thank you.
Take care.